Yes. Welcome, viewers, to Bharat and Geopolitics, your source for insightful discussion on the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I am thrilled to have you join us as we delve into the complexities of this geopolitical crisis and its far reaching implications. Throughout this podcast series, we'll be navigating the historical context, political dynamics, and humanitarian concerns surrounding the conflict. We aim to provide a balanced perspective, drawing on expert analysis, first-hand accounts, and diverse viewpoints to foster a deeper understanding of this critical issue. Join us as we explore the latest developments, untangle the narratives, and engage in meaningful conversations about the path forward for Ukraine, Russia, and the international community. Thank you for tuning in. Let's embark on this journey of this knowledge and awareness together. We are honored to have Dr. Adityanjee join us today to share their expertise and insights on geopolitics. Dr. Adityanjee brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the table, making them valuable additions to our conversation. We are eager to hear his unique perspective and engage in an enriching dialogue that will surely benefit our listeners. Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, for taking time to be with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sena, for inviting me for this particular discussion, and I'm very pleased to be here.
So, sir, coming to the topic, we see the Russia-Ukraine war has entered the third year, which was earlier thought was a quick war. Even the Russia was thinking like that. Even the international community was of the opinion it will finish in a matter of days. So this is a matter of concern for all the peace-loving persons. So I am here with a few questions, and that concerned us, and I think there are many people who think with me. So, Dr. Adityanji, what are the potential outcome of war you think in 2024? It seems like it will turn out to be like a Vietnam or Afghanistan war. There is no end in sight. So, please comment on this.
Well, Mr. Sena, where I sit, it is still February 24th, 2024. And that's a historical date because it is exactly 2 years ago that Russia under Vladimir Putin started quote unquote special military operation in Ukraine. Actually, when this war started, for almost a week, Russia was amassing its forces on the borders on the northern and eastern border of Ukraine. And that time they had around 135,000 soldiers. There was a sense of complacency in Ukraine at that point in time. They kept on denying that Russia has any intention of actually entering into a war, and it is just shadow boxing. Having said that, Russia did start war, and there was an 18-mile column of heavy armored vehicles and tanks that went towards Ukrainian capital, Kiev, and it was stuck because a large number of tanks and heavy armored vehicles, they ran out of fuel or there were mechanical breakdowns. So that was reflective of the poor planning Russia went in. Russia probably had the example of annexation of Crimea in 2014,
Yeah.
which was done in a very swift manner, and there was no opposition, credible opposition at that time. So it appears that Russia miscalculated.
Yeah.
By their own planning, it was supposed to have been over within a week. And their stated aims never materialized because they were thinking of quickly capturing Kiev and decapitating the Ukrainian government, either eliminating or arresting Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky. None of those things happened. Yes, Russia did control almost 20% of Ukrainian territory, but this became a protracted war. And as you've said, that is it becoming more like Vietnam or Afghanistan? Indeed, yes. 2 years are already over. There was supposedly a negotiated solution that was arrived at between the two parties in April of 2022. So that's just within a couple of months of starting the war. That putative negotiated solution was scuttled by one person, and that person was Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of UK. So that tells you about the external factors driving this war. The Prime Minister of India already stated publicly to Vladimir Putin that this is not an era of war. So yes, continuation of this war is in nobody's interest because it is affecting the entire world because food prices have gone up.
Yeah.
There are other problems. It does not appear under the current circumstances that there will be a negotiated solution. And the reason is the lack of will on part of Ukraine to go for negotiated solution.
Right.
The so-called peace solution that Zelensky has put forward is a non-starter. I think he has suggested a 10-point solution for almost more than a year, but either he is delusional or he is being remote controlled because, you know, it is totally against the reality Zelensky is facing. He wants complete withdrawal of Russian forces from his territory to restore the status quo ante that prevailed on February 21st, 2022. That's not going to happen. He wants Putin to be held accountable for criminal charges, and he wants Russia to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction, etc., etc. These are unreasonable demands that will never be fulfilled. Putin is the president of Russia and he's not going to surrender himself for international prosecution.
Mm.
So it does not look like that there's an appetite in Ukraine for a realistic negotiated settlement. Short of that, the war will continue. Actually, the war has widened. It is no longer war between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
There are definitely other parties to the war, and these other parties are number one is NATO, which has an indirect, undeclared war against Russia. although Ukraine is not a NATO member, but NATO countries are supporting the war. There is definitely EU involvement, European Union involvement. So war is definitely widening. There are other state actors, including United States. The billions of dollars that are being sent by United States and the advanced arms that are being supplied to Ukraine are perpetuating this war.
Yeah.
There are non-state actors also from both the sides.
Like,
Well, there are mercenaries that are fighting war on both the sides. And in Ukraine, the mercenaries are from the West, including United States. There was actually in Ukrainian army a division created for foreign fighters. So there are either retired armed force personnel from EU, NATO countries, and from United States that went to Ukraine to fight the war. From Russian side, the most prominent non-state actor was the Wagner group. And of course, after a while, there was some internal problem between Wagner group and Putin, and it led to basically a rebellion by the Wagner group. The chief of the Wagner group had to leave Russia, go to Belarus, and I think he died or something like that, or was assassinated. As we speak, Russia has started to give citizenship to any foreign fighter. So there are hired combatants on the Russian side from Africa. Wagner Group was primarily operative in Africa. The government of Nepal has made a representation to Russia to release all the Nepalese who were recruited as security assistants. And my understanding that there are 15,000 Nepalese people who were fraudulently recruited to help the Russian army, but not to be combatants, but they are being sent on the war front to fight the war. And of course, there are some reports about some Indian citizens also fighting on the battlefield on the part of Russian army. The point I'm trying to make that it is no longer a restricted, limited war when it started. It has widened already. And although one would not like this to be, blow up into more complex, regional, or even for that matter, world war, because no other countries outside the Europe want to be part of this.
I
Yes,
see.
there is some support to Russia in terms of arms. Drones are being provided by Iran and North Korea to Russia. But then on the other hand, Ukraine is getting advanced weapons from United States, from Germany, from Poland, from UK. So each party has its partners, and Russia is being given indirect support by China, although China does not want to supply weapons or will never send its forces, but China is indirectly, implicitly supporting Russia. So we are into wider escalation of war. 2 years have already started. 2 years have already ended after the war was started. And there does not seem to be an appetite for a negotiated settlement or ceasefire, giving face-saving solution to both the parties.
I am very curious to know how this the Indian and the Nepali people reached there, got involved, because I think that there is no connection between Russia and Nepal. I have
Okay.
not seen.
So you know that both Nepal and India are labor surplus countries with lack of job opportunities domestically. Indian labor goes anywhere there's a need. Same happens with the Nepalese labor sector. Uh, Indians are everywhere in the West Asia region because domestic job opportunities are limited. Same thing happens with Nepalese people. And one does not know how these people were recruited, but understanding is that they were fraudulently recruited. They were told that they will be just helping on the side the armed forces of Russia in the security assistance mode, but they've been actually sent for war fighting.
I see. So my most interesting question that I am eager to learn actually. So, do you think the causes of this war is rooted in history, or behind this war is the US and the NATO?
Well, every war has some historical antecedent, and causes of this war are previous conflicts in Europe. After Second World War, there was a prolonged Cold War between Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, and the NATO, or primarily between Soviet Union and United States. But in 1991, when Soviet Union dissolved itself, and there were successor states like Russian Federation and Ukraine and Belarus and all the Central Asian republics that got independence, the Warsaw Pact also disbanded.
Oh,
One would have expected that the logical sequence would be that NATO also disbands itself because NATO was formed basically to tackle the Soviet threat. And if the Soviet threat was not there, Soviet Union was not there, what was the reason or rationale for NATO to continue? Now
yes,
that did not happen. In fact, NATO went very aggressively expanding in the region, and from 18 countries, at this point in time, NATO probably has around 30 countries, the latest being Finland. So
I see.
eastward expansion of NATO was a threat to Russian Federation. There was a lot of concern about Ukraine joining NATO, and Russia had drawn a red line. And one of the easiest way to avoid this war would have been for Ukraine to make a proclamation that it will be a neutral state or a buffer state between NATO and Russian Federation. If Ukraine had given that undertaking in writing and not went into dalliance with NATO about joining NATO and all that sort of thing, probably the war may not have happened. So NATO countries and NATO leadership, which is United States, continued to indulge in pinpricks to the Russian Federation.
Yeah,
Let's not forget that in 1990s there was triumphant aggression and expansion of NATO. Countries in the Eastern Europe were targeted. There was a country by name Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was just like Soviet Union, which was contrived to be broken into 5 or 6 republics. Now, yes, there were two states of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia that wanted to be part of the West, uh, Slovenia and Croatia. But others wanted to keep the Union, but then there was a civil war between Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and NATO actually supported basically Bosnian leadership. And you saw that, even after total breakup of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, things did not stop. NATO continued to hold aggressive actions towards Serbia.
Yeah.
The military gains of Serbs were reversed by war, and even part of Serbia was snatched away in the form of a very small country of Kosovo. There was a famous Madeline's War that went on for 78 days when Serbia's civilian infrastructure was bombed to bring Serbia to knees so that Serbia stops giving support to Bosnian Serbs who were fighting against the Bosnian state. So there is a history to everything. And Ukraine, although it was an independent country and supposedly democratic, West kept on interfering in the elections. And there was a president elected, Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Viktor Yanukovych lost two successive elections in Ukraine. He was more sympathetic to Russian Federation, former communist. But third time he won the Ukrainian presidential election, I think it was around 2009 or 2010. And then he won the second term also. After winning the second term, there was a CIA-inspired coup against him by so-called Maidan Revolution in 2014, in which some of the deep state operatives were involved. Money was poured in to Ukraine to destabilize the Ukrainian government of that time that was democratically elected. Maidan Revolution was engineered. Viktor Yanukovych had to flee Ukraine to Russia. When you have a democratically elected president, all you have to do is wait for the next presidential cycle
Yeah.
and let the electorate decide. But no, if you engineer rebellion in a democracy, pour millions of dollars, and of course, one American operative, uh, you know, the conversations were recorded and leaked. So was there basically admitting support to this rebellion. So there were a lot of interference, a lot of things happening in the region that were not very apparent. Point is that there were Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 accords signed, but they were never implemented between Russia and Ukraine. And these actually accords were just signed to give sort of breathing space to Ukraine. And there was no intention of implementing them. And of
So,
course, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. And there was a historical antecedent for that also because Crimea was always part of Russian Federation till 1954. In 1953, Khrushchev became the general secretary of the Soviet Union, Soviet Communist Party. Khrushchev himself was a Ukrainian, so what he did that he transferred Crimean Peninsula from Russian Federation's control to Ukraine, his home state, and that continued. So in order to have access to the Black Sea, Russian Federation annexed Crimea in 2014. They feel that they were just righting the wrongs done by the history, especially by Khrushchev. A lot of people don't realize that Crimea was part of Russian Federation. So I'm bringing all these things to tell you, yes, there were historical antecedents, and yes, the European Union and NATO and the generic West, led by United States, were interfering in the former Eastern Bloc countries, expanding their influence and hegemony. And, you know, it was perceived as a threat to Russian Federation if you bring NATO into Ukraine, which is next door to Russia. Being part of NATO also means that nuclear weapons would be stationed there.
Yeah.
And that was not acceptable to Russian Federation. And the result is this war.
So what I see after the dissolution of Soviet Union, the biggest state, Russia, became a passive player in geopolitics. And the way things were changing in Europe and especially the US and the NATO countries are playing with this, that actually always happened. But Russians should have reacted earlier before this war.
I think you are right, but again, we have to see the background. In fact, in 2014, there were some political scientists like John Mearsheimer who had predicted that there will be a hot war. Even for that matter, Henry Kissinger, prior to his death, for a long period of time, had kept on opposing NATO interference and NATO eastward expansion on Russia's doorstep, especially Ukraine, saying that this would be suicidal for NATO because what you are doing by extending NATO to Russia's border, you're poking a sleeping bear in the eye. If the bear was sleeping, why did you poke in the eye?
Yeah.
And Russia was sleeping, and there were reasons for that. If you remember, at the time of dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Soviet leader was Mikhail Gorbachev, and Mikhail Gorbachev's political adversary was Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin had won the presidential election of the Russian Federation, and it was Boris Yeltsin who, along with the leaders of Belarus or Byelorussia and Ukraine, held a Slavic summit in which these three Slavic nations or Slavic states, part of Soviet Union, decided to dissolve the Soviet Union and have their independent countries. Now, for all we know, Boris Yeltsin was heavily under influence of the West. Boris Yeltsin was also an alcoholic, a confirmed alcoholic. For him, the only point was his own political survival. He was not, Russian economy was in shambles. Soviet Union had dissolved and all the Soviet state paraphernalia was gone. And when NATO under Bill Clinton's leadership was aggressively, triumphantly expanding eastward, Boris Yeltsin had no wherewithal to deal with that. And I think this was like a kind of I scratch my back, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. The West, NATO, and United States did not want to touch Boris Yeltsin, although he was no Democrat. He, in fact, attacked the Russian parliament with tanks when the Russian parliament at that time was bringing no confidence motion against him. In fact, he was so incensed that the vice president of Russian Federation went against him in this process, that he sacked the vice president and he altered the constitution of Russia and eliminated the position of vice president and changed the constitution in such a manner that he, as the president, gets to appoint the prime minister. So there was no real threat. So Russian Federation, because West was supporting Boris Yeltsin despite him being very unpopular and indulging in corrupt practices, did not want to deal with NATO expansionism. And in fact, towards the end of his political career and prior to his retirement, Boris Yeltsin went into a spree. He would appoint a very junior guy as a prime minister for 3 months or 5 months. Basically, he was testing the grounds whether this person can hold the power and promise him that Boris Yeltsin, after retirement, will not be prosecuted for the crimes against the state. And the person who found most compliant was KGB's successor agency, FSB, personnel by name Vladimir Putin. So, in other words, West was complicit in transition of power in a non-democratic manner from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin was finally appointed prime minister by Boris Yeltsin without being elected for several periods of several months before Boris Yeltsin resigned, and Vladimir Putin became again by default the president of Russian Federation. So West, for its own triumphant gains and expansionism, tolerated Boris Yeltsin, an alcoholic. And yes, Vladimir Putin did not prosecute Boris Yeltsin till he died. And the rest is history. So I guess that answers the question you asked.
Yeah, yeah. So my next question is, do you think the US and the NATO countries and the EU, European Union, will continue supporting Ukraine till it wins the war?
They will continue supporting Ukraine because they have done so blatantly. And now it is a point of no return. I don't envisage that the war can be won by either of the sides. It's a stalemate. It's a quagmire. Why? The NATO and United States have no appetite for boots on the ground.
Yeah.
United States has burnt its fingers in several wars, whether it was Vietnam War, whether it was war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, by sending their troops. There's no appetite for sending American troops to any theater of war in United States. Any president who does that will be probably voted out in the next term. Similarly, NATO cannot send its own troops because Ukraine is not a NATO member. And if NATO sends NATO troops, just like they sent into Afghanistan and Iraq, it would be a direct war between NATO and Russian Federation. But they are supporting by any other means, by financial means, by providing advanced weapons and training, to the extent that now, of course, Ukrainian pilots are flying F-16s, German tanks are coming into Ukraine. So they are gung-ho supplying arms, ammunitions, mercenaries, moral support, diplomatic support to Ukraine. So Ukraine has already lost 1/5 of its territory, so there is no incentive for Ukraine to end the war. Either they accept that they've lost 1/5 of their territory, the eastern part of Ukraine, to Russia. Russia is in no mood to vacate that aggression because they have lost their soldiers. By this estimate today, till today, Russia has lost almost 83,000 soldiers. And Ukraine may have lost anywhere between 150 to 200,000 soldiers in this war. So the human cost and material cost and economic cost by both countries huge. Having said that, Russia is next door to Ukraine, so it is very easy for Russia to mobilize resources. And Russia did that by bringing conscription, having a new army of 400,000 new Russian conscripts, involving prisoners from Russian Federation into conscripting the prisoners into the war fighting machinery. So Russia has, increased the production of arms and ammunition in a very rapid time. Then despite Western sanctions, Russian economy has really not suffered because it sells commodities and there's a market for commodities.
Yeah.
China is buying everything from Russia. India purchased some oil from Russia, and Russia is being provided drones and other support by North Korea and Iran. So the war has become wider. There is no penchant for negotiated solution for either sides because the demands of Ukraine are phenomenal, unsatisfiable. I mean, why would Putin agree to his own prosecution and arrest?
So, what are the implications of the war for the international community now?
The implications are not good. War is never a good option. The entire world is suffering because food prices are shot up. Ukraine was the granary of the whole world. And for a significant period of time, the export of grain was halted because of the war. And then there was a agreement supported by Turkey, to use the Black Sea route for shipping the grains. And there were other issues. So periodically the grain export is there, other times it's not there. So food prices globally have shot up. Energy prices had shot up because of the sanctions. There is no appetite for non-European countries to become part of this white tribal European war. Let me be very blunt about it.
Yeah.
There is no skin in the game for Asian or African countries to be involved in this war. Having said that, the Europeans, as Dr. S. Jaishankar states, have a tendency to make their own problems as world's problems, and that is what Europeans are trying to do.
Yeah.
That they want to involve the entire world into you are with us or you are against us. Ukraine versus Russia has two moralistic choices. There are no moralistic choices. Both parties are rogue parties. West is trying to portray that we are defending democracy. Where is democracy in Ukraine? We have a situation that you depose a duly elected leader by sending millions of dollars and exploiting disgruntled elements domestically in the Maidan revolution. And at this point in time, Zelensky was elected in 2019. What he did after becoming president, he arrested all his democratic opponents and put them in jail. He changed the laws, and as soon as this war was declared, he suspended democracy. He introduced martial law. At this point in time, Volodymyr Zelensky is the chief martial law administrator of Ukraine. There is no democracy in Ukraine. He is not willing to have the second election, presidential election in Ukraine, which is due now. compared this to Russian Federation, you can say that Putin is authoritarian, he's not a democrat or whatever, but at least he's willing to have the election. And he knows that he has enough democratic support from Russian population because of his hyper nationalistic agenda that he will be re-elected. Yes, he has also fussed with the electoral system and all. So point I'm trying to make that there is no moral choices here for the rest of the world. Both are compromise parties, both are not true democracies, whether it is Russian Federation or it is Ukraine. Ukraine is, being remote controlled by NATO and EU. Zelensky cannot take decisions independently. He has to consult with his handlers from the West.
Yeah, that's the
So,
problem actually.
so that's the problem. So, why should Asian countries or African countries have any incentive to be part of either Ukraine or West in this conflict or with Russian Federation? Let them fight, they will keep on fighting. Europeans have this tribal mentality, expansionist mentality. They conquered the entire world, colonized the entire world, and even after decolonization, they use colonization by other means, whether it
Yeah.
is intellectual property rights or free trade or freedom of expression or labor standards. West has always tried to continue to colonize, if not physically, then intellectually. And those attempts are still there. Wherever they get an opportunity, they start a war.
So my similar question is, what are the economic consequences? Russia can bear the brunt. What about Ukraine? Where the Zelensky is taking Ukraine?
Well, Zelensky is not a politician. He was a comedian. He was a comedian and actor. And I think this comedian is being played like a flute
Yeah.
or is like a puppet. So whoever pulls the strings is pulling his actions. And yes, there is consequences to Ukraine. Out of 45 million population of Ukraine now, there are only 22 million people in Ukraine. Half of the population has fled Ukraine. They've gone elsewhere, wherever they could find shelter, because they didn't want to be part of the war. Ukraine's economy has been decimated. Ukraine is dependent on foreign aid. Russian economy has not done so well as it would have done, but because Russia is a commodity producing country, they have infinite natural resources. But economy of both countries are suffering. Russia is definitely being affected by the Western sanctions, although they are not getting deterred by those sanctions. So both countries are in a situation that their economies and people are suffering. I already mentioned that 83,000 Russian soldiers have died, and conservative estimate is between 150 to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers may have died. And this comedian, come president, come chief marshal or administrator, come dictator of Ukraine, he's having good time. People say that his wife goes to, choicest supermarkets in London to do shopping and purchases millions of dollars worth of luxury items. So he is making money in the name of the war. His family is prospering, but poor Ukrainians are suffering. And I'm pretty sure if there were free and fair elections conducted in Ukraine at this point in time under international supervision, this guy will lose his deposit. But those elections will never be held because he has already cancelled the elections. He has suspended the Ukrainian parliament. And He is just governing as a chief martial law administrator.
Yeah. So, as I am feeling, the US will never allow the war to end because they are gaining a lot. What do you say? It has been the hell bent upon finishing the Russia for a long time. The way the world order is changing and the Asian power are rising, the US is frustrated. So, your comments?
Well, to be very frank, there's a segment in the State Department of United States that has not given up its Cold War hangover. And these Mandarins establishment members still believe that their mortal enemy and strategic adversary is Russia or the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the party that is governing in the United States and the president, they belong to the old Democratic Party, old Democrat Party, which is more fixated on Russia, threat from Russia, and fails to see the threat coming from China.
Yeah.
And that is a intellectual and strategic failure of constipated thinking. The constipated thinking is from the Cold War era, and these people have never given up their anti-Russia stance. So they keep on accommodating communist China on every front, disregarding the threat from China. And Chinese president is smart enough to play them like a flute. He does not want to enter into a direct war with United States, but keeps on gaining concessions. It was under Democratic presidency of Barack Hussein Obama that China militarized South China Sea and created assets in form of artificial islands and reefs and developed uh, landing strips and stationed fighter aircraft in these artificial islands in South China Sea. As we speak, Chinese threat to Philippines is increasing. As we speak, Chinese threat to Taiwan is increasing. So I would say that a faction of US policy establishment is blindly anti-Russian. And when this war started, there were some think tanks, DC-based think tanks, that talked about breaking Russian Federation into smaller entities. And they openly said that, look, we won the Cold War, we broke the Soviet Union, we will use the same model to break Russian Federation into smaller entities. So yes, there is one part of United States, not just wishful thinking, but also attempted geopolitical interference in East Asia and the former Soviet bloc countries to keep on needling Russian Federation. On the other hand, Russian Federation is led by Vladimir Putin since 1999. It's 25 years, one way or the other. When
Yeah.
he came to power, he was in early 50s. Now he's in his 70s, and probably he is the president for life of Russian Federation.
Yeah.
Yes, he is not a Democrat. He's a ruthless dictator, elected democratically, of course, by almost 90% of the popular support, which is true because Putin remains popular in Russia. And one of the reason is hyper nationalism. A number of Russian leaders feel that dissolution of disintegration of Soviet Union was detrimental to their strategic interests. Putin himself has said that, and one of his unstated goals is to gain all the territory that Soviet Union controlled. Again, both the sides are equally guilty.
Yeah.
Nobody is washed in milk. So it's a complex geopolitical problem that both adversaries are trying to, you know, provoke each other. Not just Ukraine, they were, in Georgia, in Moldova, there were small skirmishes here and there till Putin decided to, Putin or Medvedev decided to take firm action in actually Georgia uh, when Georgian president was acting stupidly against Russian Federation because Georgia was again a small state. You are again poking the bear by trying to engineer problems in a Russian controlled region. So I believe that these hostilities will continue because neither of the parties, it's not Ukraine and Russia, it is Russian Federation and whole of NATO, EU, and United States.
So, coming to US and the Russian Federation, after the dissolution of Soviet Union, Russia kept to itself. They stopped meddling in the international affairs. But US has been more aggressive. They were thinking we are the sole superpower, so we have to just impose our will to on every country. So that has led to many problems for many countries.
I think
If
that
I am
is very true. That is definitely very true. I describe Russian Federation as a sleeping bear. And of course, United States, under the leadership of William Jefferson Clinton, who was president between 1992 and year 2000, went in a very aggressive, triumphant expansionism of NATO, disregarding any sane advice. And at that time, American mantra was, we won the Cold War, deal with it. We will continue to expand NATO. There was no NATO has lost its purpose after disintegration of Soviet Union and dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. NATO should have been disbanded. People gave these warnings umpteen times, as late as 2014 when John Mearsheimer was saying, is a political scientist from University of Chicago, that you are poking the bear. Don't do that. Don't bring NATO at the doorstep of Russian Federation. Remember what happened during Cuban Missile Crisis when, you know, John F. Kennedy got into fight with
yeah,
Soviet Union because Soviet Union had placed some nuclear missiles in, you know, Cuba.
Cuba, Cuba.
And there was a problem, there was a threatened war that almost came to the level of a nuclear war. And then both the parties blinked, Russians first or Soviets first, and decided to remove those nuclear missiles from Cuba. And of course, John F. Kennedy had this stupid failed Bay of Pigs operation, covert operation. Although Russia was weakened, it was a country with largest number of nuclear weapons. And that is what NATO and the West and US did not realize, that Russia has become isolationist. They have their internal problems. Don't poke it so much. You know, Don't do 1,000 pinpricks to bleed it to death, because it will not bleed to death. The sleeping bear will get enraged. And actually, that is what is happening now.
So, sir, we have only 5 minutes of time left. So, my final question is,
Hmm.
how do you evaluate the leadership of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky? How will be remembered in history?
He will be remembered as quote unquote useful idiot of the West, who personally enriched himself but got his country destroyed totally. Ukraine of 2013 no longer exists. It lost Crimean Peninsula in 2014. It has lost 20% of its territory, and there's no way it will be able to regain that territory. This guy was playing to the tunes of the West, and the ultimate sufferer is state of Ukraine. That will never be the same. There is no way they can dislodge at this point in time Russia from the territory Russia has acquired. They have incorporated the breakaway republics into the Russian Federation, given the Russian citizenship, and that eastern part of Ukraine, the former eastern part of Ukraine that is now part of Russian Federation, is Russian
Yeah.
speaking. And actually, all said and done, when uh, Vladimir Putin talked about denazification of Ukraine, he was referring to a situation of severe human rights violations of Russian speaking Ukrainian population in the eastern part of Ukraine. They were being persecuted, they were being harassed for being Russian and Russian speaking. So, when the history is written, Vladimir Putin, of course, will be remembered as a ruthless dictator, but a smart, shrewd operator who managed to. This is the 25th year. He is likely to be president for life of the Russian Federation. But Vladimir Zelensky will not be perceived very kindly, because despite his so-called nationalistic credentials and is wearing the army fatigues and acting the soldier
Yeah.
president, he has lost on all strategic objectives.
Right.
His country is decimated, scorched earth. What has Ukraine gained by being a fiddle of the West, a lapdog of NATO? Nothing. If there was some smartness, they would say, okay, we are a neutral buffer state between NATO and Russian Federation. We will have good relations with both these countries, with both these blocs, because NATO is not a country, but we will not be a member of NATO. And if
Then,
they had given that written undertaking to Russian Federation, there was no need for Russian Federation to attack Ukraine. And there was no need to ill-treat Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine.
yeah, that was a biggest mistake, I think, because ill-treating the own people on
Yes.
any ground.
So wherever there was a fire, there is smoke. There's no smoke without the fire. There was fire in eastern Ukraine, lit by Ukrainian government.
So, thank you so much, sir, for your time. This was really a very enlightening and a lot of things we have learned. So, we are very pleased to have you here.
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Sinha. I'm not going to say I'm very pleased to be here, because Again, in the words of the Prime Minister of India, this is not an era of war. Nobody rejoices having a war situation because it affects the entire world. I hope the saner minds prevail on both the sides and there's a negotiated settlement, if any.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, viewers. We'll be meeting again soon. If you have any comment, any suggestion, or any question on your mind, do write here. We'll be answering that question. Please like the video and share the video. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.